Everybody, good morning.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
Well, good afternoon for some of you, right? Or evening.
Yeah, I think we span the global time zones on this call today.
Yeah.
Hello, Asma. I haven't seen you in a while as well.
Hi, Asif.
Good to
Thank
see
you for joining. Good to see you.
Absolutely. So is anybody in New York actually for this at all? Or is it all happening in online?
I think Mark might be the closest to New York, being in New Haven, Connecticut.
We're all, it's all virtual, as if.
Okay.
I don't think even heads of government stayed away. Yeah, it must be a very strange Unga week. Probably the best Unga week for New Yorkers ever.
Absolutely. No traffic.
Yeah.
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 So we are live now. Basim will wait your...
Yes, we are. You can go ahead, Dr. Asma.
Stavros?
You want me to start?
Yes, please.
Directly? Okay. Well, a very warm welcome to everyone from around the world. My name is Stavros Yanuka. I'm the Chief Executive of WISE, and it's my pleasure to welcome everyone for the launch of our ebook, Education Disrupted, Education Reimagined. This is the product of over 6 months of collaborative work between 3 terrific partners: Salzburg Global Seminar, the Diplomatic Courier, and of course, Qatar Foundation's WISE. This ebook really reflects the value and the values of WISE. We are a trusted global movement dedicated to building the future of education by identifying, recognizing, and supporting innovation in education that fulfills our shared aspiration of making quality education for all a reality, no matter the circumstances. And in the spirit of those values, this ebook really reflects the true diversity of voices that are experiencing and reflecting on this crisis and its implications on education. The book has collected contributions from over 50 authors from around the world, from prime ministers, former prime ministers and CEOs like Gordon Brown and Sheikha Hind, to researchers and thought leaders like Andreas Schleicher and Manos Antoninis, and of course to practitioners like Deborah Kimati and Greg Moncada, who are working on the front lines. It represents, I think, real-time value as a documentary of reflections and responses to arguably the greatest education challenge in over a generation. The book puts forward a range of reactions, from concern, of course, that this crisis will exacerbate an already acute situation in education and set us even further back in our efforts to meet the Sustainable Development Goal of universal quality education. But it also, I think, tends towards optimism that this crisis will provide the impetus for us to seize the opportunity to fundamentally rethink the why, the what, and the how of education. Over the coming few hours, we're going to hear from a selection of authors who will give their own perspectives on what is happening and share their reflections on how we can rise to the occasion and use this crisis as an opportunity to gain added momentum towards fulfilling the SDG of universal quality education for all. Before that, though, it's my pleasure to give the floor to Dominic Register from Salzburg Global Seminar to say a few words. Dominic, over to you.
Thank you, Stavros, and hello, everyone. Let me add my welcome to the launch of the ebook, Education Disrupted, Education Reimagined, Thoughts and Responses from Education's Frontline During the COVID-19 Pandemic and Beyond. I would like to begin by thanking Qatar Foundation and the Qatari Mission to the United Nations for supporting this event. My name's Dominic Register, and I'm a Program Director at Salzburg Global Seminar. We're an independent strategic convening organization based in Salzburg in Austria, and we were founded at almost the same time as the United Nations. Our core mission is to challenge current and future leaders to shape a better world. At the beginning of August this year, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres described the COVID-19 pandemic as having led to the largest disruption of education in history. Over 1 billion children have been affected, with the most vulnerable, learners with disabilities, those in minority or disadvantaged communities, displaced and refugee students, and those in remote areas at the highest risk of being left behind. In the same speech, the Secretary General also spoke about how we are at a defining moment for the world's children and young people, and that we have a generational opportunity to reimagine education. And for all of the chaos, the grief, the trauma and disruption that the pandemic has caused, it has also created that space for reimagining education. And as the title of the ebook implies, that is one of the dominant themes throughout it. Now, some of the ideas in the book are new, but many of them have been discussed for a while. There is that great Milton Friedman quote that we've used at a previous conference, that when a crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. When we started the conference series that has led to this book back in April, we were particularly interested in hearing from speakers who were involved in frontline education responses to the crisis, and from speakers who had been looking at education reform issues from before the pandemic that could be of real help at this point in time. Because this is, of course, a moment of convergent crises. There is the pandemic, the climate crisis, the learning crisis that predates the pandemic, and the mental health crisis for young people, to name but a few. And education reform is a critical part of the response to all of these crises. This launch event is part of the UN Global Goals Week, and we are obviously focused primarily on SDG 4 to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and to promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. Inclusion and quality education are key themes throughout the book. Many of the authors talk about social and emotional learning as a critical part of that response. Another dominant theme throughout the book is education leadership, and we're lucky to have an expert panel with us today, all of whom have displayed great social and emotional skills and great leadership throughout their careers. Education is in many ways, of course, a great enabling sustainable development goal. If we as a global community achieve the education targets, then it will help maintain progress made in many of the other goals. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation that's going to take place over the next 90 minutes. I think we're going to have a really interesting process of sharing and collaboration. In a minute, my colleague Julia Kirby will introduce the speakers, and Julia and I will then ask each of them an opening question, and we will then have a conversation between the 8 of us and bring in as many questions from the audience as possible. So please post your questions in the chat function on Zoom, and we will try to get through as many of them as possible. When you're posting a question, then please make sure that it's set to panelists and all attendees so that everyone can see it. So Julia, over to you.
Thank you so much, Dominic. It is my pleasure to introduce our amazing panel of speakers today, each one of them contributors to our ebook, as well as previous contributors to our event series, Education Disrupted, Education Reimagined. We are really honored and privileged to have such a distinguished group here with us today. First, I'd like to introduce Asif Saleh, the Executive Director of BRAC Bangladesh. I'm sure most of you joining us today know BRAC, but perhaps you didn't know that BRAC's education program is so extensive in terms of size, geographical reach, and duration. It has been part of Bangladesh for over 30 years, that first generations of BRAC students who have matriculated from their program are many of them now teachers themselves and are just watching their own classes graduate, which is amazing. Welcome, Asif. We are so glad to have you with us today. Next, I would like to introduce Dr. Daniela Beckley, Chair of the Sierra Leone Teaching Commission. In addition to her years of tireless work improving educational outcomes in her own country, Sierra Leone, including during the Ebola pandemic in 2014, it is fitting on the occasion of UN Global Goals Week to point out that Dr. Beckley has also worked for UNICEF for nearly 2 decades as Chief of Education in Nigeria and in Pakistan, and also as Regional Education Chief in the MENA region and West and Central Africa. In her current position at the Sierra Leone Teaching Commission, she oversees 1/3 of the public workforce in her country, which is amazing. Thank you, Daniela. I would also like to welcome Dr. Rebecca Telford to the digital stage. Dr. Telford is the Chief of Education at UNHCR, which is the UN Refugee Agency. There, she supports over 7 million school-age refugee children affected by crisis and conflict in getting an education. In Becky's 20-year career as an education specialist working with vulnerable children, she has held positions at UNICEF, War Child Holland, and DFID. Thank you for joining us, Becky. Next, we are also honored to have Dr. Mark Brackett here, joining us from the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, which he is the founder and director of. Many of you probably have heard of Mark's work and his wildly popular book, Permission to Feel, and perhaps some of you have even joined his Permission to Feel book club online. What you might not know is that Mark's ruler approach to social and emotional learning has been adopted by nearly 2,000 K-12 schools across the US and around the world. Thanks so much, Mark, for being here. We are also delighted to welcome Daniela Labra Cardero to the panel today. Daniela is the co-founder and director of the social and emotional educational nonprofit in Mexico, AtentaMente. Since its founding in 2013, AtentaMente has made remarkable impact within Mexico by offering training to over 200,000 teachers in partnership with the Mexican Ministry of Education. And she has also designed a national social and emotional curriculum for Mexican public schools. I was delighted to also meet Daniela in person last year when meeting in person was still a thing. In Salzburg for a Salzburg Global Seminar program. And there I learned that she's also been an active practitioner of meditation for over 2 decades and even studied at the Tibetan Buddhist Interpretation Training Program at the University of Kathmandu. Thank you, Daniela. Finally, we are incredibly honored to have Andreas Schleicher with us today. Andreas almost needs no introduction as the Director for Education and Skills at the OECD. He has initiated and oversees the Program for International Student Assessment, known as PISA, which has become the benchmark for education policymakers globally to inform national educational policy and practice. An interesting anecdote that I recently learned about Andreas is that the former UK Secretary of State, Michael Gove, once called him the most important man in English education, even though Andreas himself is German and lives in France, which is further evidence of Andreas's global influence in the field. Welcome, Andreas, and thank you so much for being here today. So to kick off this panel, we'd like to start off with a question for each of you. This year, the UN General Assembly and Global Goals Week feels particularly significant as we are celebrating UNGA at 75 and also entering what the UN is calling the Decade of Action in terms of achieving SDGs. However, unpredictably, we are also finding ourselves this year as a global community in the midst of grappling with and trying to recover from one of the worst crises in recent history, the COVID-19 pandemic, which many are saying has set back progress towards achieving the SDGs by at least a decade, if not more. And if COVID-19 has taught us anything, it is how interconnected all of the SDGs are. What started as a global public health crisis quickly spiraled into an economic crisis, a social crisis, and an education crisis as well. So Asif, if it's okay, I'd like to start with you. In your piece in the ebook, you write about using this time of disruption to accelerate scalable, frugal innovation in how education is delivered to vulnerable populations in Bangladesh. Can you talk more about what scalable innovation means in your context and how the lessons learned from the COVID-19 crisis can be used to help countries embark on sustainable, resilient development pathways? Over to you, Asif.
Thank you so much, Julia, for having me, and congratulations to WISE and also Salzburg for making this happen in such a short notice. So I think based on the response from what I gather in the chat window, looks there's a lot of enthusiasm. Julia, thanks. I mean, I think if we thought the education was in crisis before COVID because of quality challenges and other access issues, I mean, what we are dealing with now, as some of you have pointed out, is so much worse. I mean, we are looking at an entire generation of children across the world who may not have the foundational literacy that is needed, right? So we're looking at a major dropout of children from schools in most of the developing countries for economic reasons. We are looking at girls disproportionately dropping out and getting married off. We are looking at a learning loss for students that we have not seen in, in this, since World War II or ever. I mean, we may get vaccines at some point soon, and we may recover from this health hazard as well, and recover from this economic fallout. But recovering from the damage to learning and education will take a long, long time. And this, unless we do something more collaboratively, and this unfortunately has disrupted lives and destroyed dreams forever for many, many children. I mean, and I think this is where I think we need to really think this through and work collaboratively. I know a lot of people, of course, talk about digital education and other things, and I don't want to be the party pooper here for digital learning, but the reality is that, you know, if you want water to come from your tap, I mean, you will need to have the underground plumbing work done. You need the pipes behind the tap as well. So when it comes to digital learning, unfortunately, the pipes are not quite there. I mean, it remains a pipe dream for the poor. So meaningful internet is mostly not there in most of the areas. Even if it's there, it's not affordable. So that means that we need to figure out a way to come up with a way where community is involved. And how do we do this? I mean, I think the fundamental base of any lasting, sustainable, impactful solution lies in ensuring community is a part of it. So schools, for example, in Bangladesh are closed for almost 6 months. In Pakistan, during the earthquake, the schools were closed for about 4 months. Then the subsequent study showed the learning loss was about for 14 months. And you can imagine the extent of the crisis this time. I mean, the thing is, this is something that the parents are realizing, community is realizing, but they're often not part of the solution here. So hence in our model, and I highlighted in our essay in the book as well, that how do we try to ensure that, you know, using low-tech technology like community radio, basic feature phone, essentially to keep the children engaged with their teachers and reduce the learning loss to some extent. And also introductions of things like clustered learning groups in parents' home in a rotational basis, then visitation of these clusters by the teachers, and essentially more ownership of the parents and the adults in the community in imparting education as well. And essentially that, but there needs to be a facilitating role there. And we will need to come together in this blended model where some technology would be used, but also a huge, much bigger role of community and parents will be there. And governments across the world also need to understand that once all the schools open, they will need to double down on the efforts to ensure the catch up on the law for the learning loss is made. And it's not just about going to the next class. I mean, here in Bangladesh, we're talking about giving auto promotion, but it's what if, I mean, so what if the auto promotion is happening? But you know, how we are going to make up the sort of the learning loss, and that is basically the crucial question. And that there needs to be an additional double down effort to provide complementary or supplementary efforts using some platform after school or using other intermediaries to ensure that the catch up actually happens. Because I mean, otherwise we are looking at a major social and educational disaster. So over to you.
Asif, thank you so much for that. There's an enormous amount for us to reflect on there, and we'll be coming back to some of those themes later in the conversation. I think I'd like to draw from the discussion of scalable innovation and inclusivity and now turn to Daniela Beckley, who, as Julia said, leads the Teaching Commission in Sierra Leone. And in addition to Daniela's own active participation in the Education Disrupted Reimagined conference series, we also had the great privilege of hearing from the Minister of Education of Sierra Leone, David Senge, in the third conference in the series last week. So Daniela, in your contribution to the book, you talked about the lessons that your country has learned from the Ebola crisis in terms of bringing innovative solutions to education challenges at scale. What key lessons have these successive public health crises taught you about bringing education, innovation, and change to scale? And what are the key learnings or innovations or partnerships that you most want to hold on to after the dust has settled on COVID-19?
Yes, thank you very much, Dominic. Good morning, listeners and viewers around the world. It's a real honor and privilege for me to be part of this. Yes, we learned from the Ebola, and we have learned even more from the current crisis about how we can reach those who are not reached and those who need to be reached. We learned that, you know, our systems need to be more resilient. It brought into really sharp focus that our infrastructure really has to be upgraded, because what we focused on during the corona is on radio teaching, lessons by radio. And we discovered that there were parts of the country that were not being reached at all. And the infrastructure was so poor that we now have to focus squarely on getting our infrastructure up and running so that all children everywhere can benefit. Ours essentially has been a radio teaching program during this crisis when there was the lockdown and schools were closed. So that was the only approach available to us. But in the process of presenting these programs, we became more aware of where we need to focus. We need to focus on children of the poor. We need to focus on children in remote areas, getting these services across to them, because we normally concentrate on the public schools. And we realize that not all public schools are the same. There are children from middle-class homes that have access to radios. But even those with access to radios that can benefit from the programs were not benefiting because of power supply, power cuts, you know, lack of electricity when you need it most. So it's telling us that there are certain things in our society that need to change. This is a new reality. Life is never going to be the same again in Sierra Leone as a country, particularly for education systems. Education systems will have to change. Our education system is really going to have to change. We realize that this is a new normal. We have to use blended and hybrid approaches. Even the radio alone, we cannot concentrate only on radio to reach children so that they can catch up on the lessons that they have lost during this crisis. We also learned that we need to pay more attention to teachers and how we prepare them. And this is not only for the Teaching Service Commission, it's also for the teacher training institutions who prepare these teachers. So there has to be a new method of preparing teachers in these institutions. Even the infrastructure in these institutions will have to be reviewed and revised. They have to be sensitive to technology. They have to accommodate new technologies. their technological needs, their equipment needs, their HR support needs. All of these will become even more apparent now. We also know that teaching and learning materials, what we call TLMs here in Sierra Leone, will have to change. You know, students are used to textbooks. We need more than textbooks. In situations like this, in crisis, we need more, much more than textbooks, supplementary materials, materials that will enable children to learn more and learn better, and also catch up on what they have lost. So when we talk of teaching and learning materials, let me take teaching materials, for example. What do teachers need? Much of the time, we look at what children need, the textbooks, the supplementary materials, but really, talking from the point of view of the Teaching Service Commission, teachers need much more. Teachers even need online materials. They need online resources to help them teach better and to reach more children, especially if the children are at home. How do you train teachers to teach online classes? Teachers also need, this is going to be a shock, but we found out that even when we tried to set up WhatsApp groups and downloaded the radio programs so that teachers on these WhatsApp groups could access them, we found that not many teachers have Android phones. That was a big shock. They have phones, but these are not Android phones. These are not phones that they can use to download materials, to be able to chat with their peers in these WhatsApp groups. So this was a lesson for us. We really have to restructure the whole thing. So this is a lesson for us. In terms of the scalability of what we're doing, right now we're working with the World Bank and others. We're working also with a consortium of international and local NGOs to see how we can scale up these interventions. We're looking at the sandbox approach. This is very new to us. We're only beginning to learn about it, to see how we can reach as many children and teachers as possible. We also have to look at how we can reach children with disabilities, because even in the radio program, there are children who are hearing impaired. How do you accommodate them? What kinds of technology will you use to reach them? So our issues right now are not only to get technology to support teaching and learning, but also to accelerate. How do we accelerate teaching and learning to make up for the time lost? Now we're looking at 1 tablet per school. We're looking at other kinds of things to reach teachers and children using technology. We are still at a learning stage, by the way, but we're excited about it because we have partners here talking about partnerships. The Save the Children Consortium, which is made up of other international partners and local entrepreneurs. There are lots of entrepreneurs coming on board now using technology for teaching and learning purposes. So I'd like to stop here.
Thank you so much, Daniela, for that really thoughtful response, and actually picking up on something you said about international partnerships and the sandbox approach. I want to turn to Dr. Rebecca Telford now from UNHCR. Welcome, Becky, as our only representative today from a UN agency, though our book did feature a whole section from 4 UN agencies, including yours, UNHCR. I wanted to reflect a bit on a report your office just released this month titled Coming Together for Refugee Education, which provides some pretty dire evidence on the state of education in the refugee community currently. A population which is already among the world's most vulnerable has been affected disproportionately during the school closures of COVID-19. Could you briefly reflect on the key findings of this report and also on what agenda items you hope that the UN member states prioritize to ensure they are building back better, fairer, more inclusive education systems for the future? Thank you, Becky.
Thank you so much. Yes, I would be very happy to, and I will also put a link in the chat to that report so people can have a look themselves. The Coming Together for Refugee Education, it's the 5th annual report the UNHCR has published that looks specifically at education for refugees. And I think what that report shows is very much that challenges for refugees have maybe not changed with COVID, they have just been massively exacerbated. And I think that's probably true for a lot of vulnerable populations. We were talking at the start about the number of children who are affected by school closures. For refugees, only 52% of them are enrolled in school. So you already have half of all refugees who are unable to access school for a whole host of reasons. I think where we have seen some traction and some good work over the last sort of 5 years has been particularly at primary school, and I think that's not unique to refugees either. The report showed this time that 77% of refugee students are enrolled in primary school, and I will say we've changed the way we've done the data, so actually that's gross enrollment ratios. But you know, 77% is still quite a long way away from the universal primary enrollment that we aim for. Though I do note that the 2015 report showed only 50% of children were enrolled in primary. So there really has been, you know, some quite good moves made there. Where we're really seeing very little traction and where we see a particular potential impact for COVID is around secondary education, and particularly secondary for girls and young women. So net enrollment for the last 5 years for refugees has stayed really at around 25% in secondary education. That's just a quarter of children having access. The gross enrollment ratio is 31%, so it's actually not that much bigger. And just quickly, gross enrollment ratio is where you count every child who's enrolled, regardless of their age. There has been a small increase there. We've seen a 2% increase over the last year. But actually that increase has been only for boys, which is quite stark. And I think our kind of big call to partners and to member states is very much around, you know, what we see is the potential for a massive backslide in terms of the gains that have been made in education. But where we're not seeing those gains so much, there's a huge risk to whole populations of people. And I think for UNHCR, the risk to girls of secondary age and adolescent girls is really enormous. One of the pieces in the report did some data modeling with the Malala Fund, and they used the information and evidence that came out of West Africa post-Ebola. And modeling that data with refugee populations, there's a finding that up to 50% of girls enrolled in secondary school will not return. They will just not be able to go back to the classroom afterwards. And there's a number of reasons for that. Some of it is about girls having to take up caring responsibilities. So if everybody is at home, if everyone's on lockdown, if there are fewer resources, girls are then expected to look after siblings. There are lots of challenges around continuity of learning, which I'm going to come on to. But there's also the huge socioeconomic impact of COVID and kind of families making balanced decisions about opportunity cost and what they do and don't value. But we see this as incredibly stark. In countries where the gross enrollment ratio currently for girls is less than 10%, the data modeling suggests that no girls will return. Dominic talked at the start about generational challenge and how COVID is a generational challenge. And I think what we see from the evidence on secondary education is very much that that's where a lot of generational shifts happen. So girls who attend secondary are more likely to marry later, to have fewer and healthier children, to be more economically involved, and to be able to then be part of communities, particularly in conflict and crisis, where those communities are able to move out of some of those cycles. So not investing in education at secondary level and not being able to come back from the potential disaster of COVID isn't just a problem now, it's a problem for the next generation of children going into school as well. And I think that all speaks to the kind of main message that we have, which I think is, you know, we obviously focus specifically on refugees, but this could be said of a number of vulnerable populations. One thing I would note, particularly for refugees, and it sometimes gets lost, is that whilst the Global Compact on Refugees really advocates for the inclusion of refugees into national systems, and we have a lot of evidence of where that works well and where it's been very successful, it doesn't happen everywhere. So the big focus of the international community has been on supporting national governments, which is absolutely right. But what we would like to say is, you know, let's look at how COVID and that support to national systems can give us a way to really fast track this work on inclusion, which has already been agreed on, but the how of inclusion has looked very difficult up till now. But what we're seeing is where children are kind of suffering from the same issues, where they're looking at making sure that things come out to host communities, things like Dr. Beckley's points about infrastructure, they're things that could benefit all populations, including refugees. And where international focus is very much on host governments, it's also just a reminder that that doesn't necessarily trickle down to refugee students. And an example of that would be where money or advocacy is going in to protect the education workforce, which is a huge piece around COVID, making sure that teachers are paid, that they're looked after, that they're able to stay healthy. A lot of refugee teachers and teachers in refugee hosting areas are not part of the national system. And so it's just being aware continually of where people are missing out and where some of the most vulnerable are. We're also calling on people to look at the process of reopening schools. The decision around reopening schools is very much a national government decision, but just making sure that where health protocols are put in place, that doesn't become a place where inequalities are also exacerbated. So in refugee schools, for example, if you have 120 students in the classroom, you can't suddenly have 25 to meet your health protocol. Where are the others going to go? How do you decide who's coming in? How do you do that in a way which is fair and which supports all children to come back, even in a phased approach, but guarding against kind of unfairly excluding people because of their immigration status or their gender or anything else. So it's really just looking at those issues. We talked a little bit about a continuity of learning and how important that is for having children not drop out. The distance learning, the remote learning, all of those pieces, educational technology, which have worked incredibly effectively, very often refugees cannot access those. There's a limited amount of hardware, a limited amount of connectivity. Very often that's about being in a remote area. So the same situation as, children in some parts of Sierra Leone, you might not be able to access even the basic FM radio signals. And so again, it's kind of looking at opportunities where we can take, for example, content made by national ministries and make sure that that's available to refugees. There was a question that came up in the chat about UNHCR's engagement with EdTech partners. And we have a number of partnerships with the private sector and with others looking at content, looking at delivery and connectivity. And I'll also put in the chat some links to some additional documents so that people can look at some of the detail of that. So I think finally, your question was also, what are we urging people to do? What are the main points that we would make? And I think that there's three really big points for us about how do you use the experience of COVID to build back better, recognizing some of the challenges in the education system, and how do we look at delivering on the promise of the Global Compact on refugees? And I think the first point is just COVID kind of showed us as a very small world. The idea that you can support one group of people and not another, certainly in health terms, is clearly nonsense. But it's the same with education. So how do we look at something which can benefit everybody? The second, I think, is really this push on support for national education systems and continuing to look at inclusion of refugees into those systems. And that comes back to the first point, which is how do you make something that works for everybody? How do we make something so that we're not creating parallel systems? We don't have to do things which are especially for refugees, but where a well-supported national government is able to roll out what they're doing and have it accessible by refugee populations. And finally, just to look at what inclusion means in terms of how the international community is tailoring supports to COVID and to education and making sure that it is reimagined for everybody, recognizing the people who might not necessarily benefit from that and thinking about how we can really meaningfully include them. Thank you.
Thanks, Becky. Switching gears slightly and turning to Mark Brackett, but I think also reflecting on the idea that a lot of the interventions we're talking about will benefit all learners. As I said in the introduction, we're in a situation of dealing with multiple crises. And I'd love it if you could speak a little bit more about how the crisis is accentuating demand or interest in your work, Mark, around supporting emotional literacy and helping schools and communities deal with mental health issues, and particularly how you're helping people develop their emotional intelligence at this time.
Thank you, Dominic. Thank you, Julia. Thank you, everyone. I'm thinking so much about what the previous panelists have said already. there's the micro level work that we have to do, and then there's the macro level work. And, children and teachers and families are embedded in systems. And I don't think at present we really have systems that are focused on the social and emotional development, of its people. And so first, I just think people need to be educated, in terms of why our emotion system matters, and, matters for pretty much everything, from our ability to be attentive and focus. Here I am, a privileged white male professor, and my anxiety levels have been higher than they've ever been in my life. And I'm having trouble focusing and having trouble being present. And so I can only imagine, right, what it's like for a child growing up in poverty, or a child growing up in a family where there is abuse. Their sympathetic nervous systems are in constant fight or flight mode, which makes it, taxing for their health. It impairs, immune function, and the list goes on. The second is decision making. It's hard to make good, sound decisions, when you're constantly stressed, right? You're in survival mode, not in sound decision-making mode. It's hard to build and maintain healthy relationships, because, how we feel each day is driving whether or not we want to approach people, or whether or not feel like we have to avoid people. The fourth one is omnipresent right now, which is our mental and physical health. We know from research clearly, and like a summary of all research that's been done globally, there is as much as an 8-fold increase in adults' anxiety levels from just 2 years ago. There's been tremendous increases in children's externalizing behaviors, just dealing with their feelings in sometimes unhelpful ways. Our own research shows that the #1 feeling of a leader in a school in the United States, or a teacher, is anxiety. Children are feeling frustrated, overwhelmed, bored, sad, and lonely. And so right now we just have a tremendous amount of emotional imbalance, in our society. And so the question is, well, what do we need to do about it? And I think one of the challenges that I see consistently across the globe is that we attack these things with piecemeal models, right? We throw an intervention here, we do a workshop here, we do an assembly there, we have a conference. This is a good conference, by the way. But we do these things and we think that's the solution. Like all of a sudden, everyone's going to be emotionally healthy and wise. And we know that this is life's work. This starts from as early as, a fetus being in the womb, right, to how the parent is feeling, during pregnancy, both parents and whatever identities they have. And then we know from, as soon as the baby is born, that co-regulation helps to, support a healthy nervous system. And then, in schools, preschool, elementary school, middle school, high school, these are developmental skills that we need to, it's like a muscle that needs constant development. And so it leads to, all right, so what are the underlying skills that we need to work on? And I think also this is where it gets confusing, that people think, they're kind of all over the place sometimes with like, it's about being a good person, or it's about being motivated, or it's about having grit, or it's about having the certain mindsets, or, it becomes overwhelming, I think, for education systems to focus on, the deeper skills that are going to support children in healthy development. And of course, my one area of focus is on emotional intelligence, which is a set of skills that we use the acronym RULER to describe, of being just highly aware of how you're feeling. Like, do we know how we're really feeling? Now, it's kind of interesting because as a professor at a high power university, you would think that all of my students would be very self-aware. I mean, they have the best education from around the world, but yet when I ask them how they're feeling, they have a hard time describing their actual feeling states, or they say stressed. And so the question is, well, is it stressed or is it something else? And, where I work, I find that most of the students feel envious. That's their real kind of problem emotion. And they don't know how to deal with the envy because they're always making comparisons to everyone else. You go someplace else and it's chronic overwhelm. And I only bring this up because I don't think that we've done a great job, Dominic, going back to your actual question, of teaching this literacy about our feelings. Are we granular? Are we specific about our experiences? It's funny, I give presentations to people who own fancy chateaus, and they can tell me all these words to describe the best red wine. And then I say, "But how are you feeling?" And I don't know. And so we have language for other areas of our lives. If you're an engineer, you have a lot of language to describe your work. But yet we have not given children, right, the education they deserve to be emotionally self-aware. And why that's important is that it leads to how we express our feelings. Do we communicate them with the people who take care of us, who love us, who teach us, who raise us? And are we safe to do that? Can we be our true, authentic feeling selves with people? And do we have the strategies to manage those feelings? You would have thought that someone with my background of a professor of emotional intelligence, like I should be able to regulate, right? Well, I will not allow you to interview my family right now because, I would probably lose my position at the university. It's been hard. And, I never expected to live in quarantine. I never expected to not go to my office for 6, 7, 8 months. I never expected to have people in my life die of COVID. I had a very close relative die of COVID last month. And so this has brought up tremendous feelings, for me. And I struggle with managing my own feelings, and I'm a so-called expert. And so you wonder, when you walk around our nation's, our world's schools, and you look at children who are in sometimes the most dire of circumstances, and you think, my goodness, what is this child learning, right, to support them in having healthy emotional development? So that's what's on my mind right now. And I just one thing I'm thinking about is, we're so preoccupied, I think, with children falling behind in their academic learning. And I couldn't agree more that we have to make sure that we stay, we push and push and push to keep things going. However, I don't remember very much from my 3rd grade social studies class. I just think that if we put so much pressure right now on everybody feeling the urgency and we're falling behind, that's going to even increase the anxiety more. And so that may make things even go backwards. And so I think we have to be very careful about ensuring that we are supporting children's whole development. And yes, cognitive development is critically important, but it needs to be done with care and safety and security. And I'll just stop there.
Thank you so much, Mark. And as a parent of a 4th grader, just graduated 3rd grade, that makes me feel a lot better and less anxious hearing you say that. Now turning to Daniela, following from Mark's comments about the importance of social emotional learning all the time, but particularly right now in this situation, do you think the pandemic, COVID-19, has put SEL and well-being squarely on the map of education officials and experts? In particular, in your context in Mexico, where your organization has designed and implemented a national SEL curriculum, which is amazing, and also trained over 200,000 teachers in SEL skill building. Do you think the importance of social and emotional learning will gain more or less traction in the post-COVID-19 period? And this is also a reflection of something that we haven't discussed yet, which is the reality that many governments will be cutting education budgets because of the economic situation. So do you think social emotional learning and well-being will be seen as enough of a policy priority going forward?
Thank you, Julia. Thank you, everyone. I'm also really so privileged and happy and honored to be here and to hear all of you and to have read your pieces. at least what I see, and I think this, we've been hearing this globally, and I can see this in Mexico pretty clearly, that social emotional learning has become, like something that we understand is important. But I think Mark is addressing something that's also very true. It's there as a topic, but we don't know really how to address it, and we're not prepared for it, right? So as we see, I think something really amazing that we can take from this crisis is that there's no way of not addressing it. Like maybe we were just kind of looking into another way, but just not looking at it like straightforward. But I think the crisis has really showed us in so many aspects, as all of you have been saying, that we have this crisis, and that mental health and emotional health is primal, is really important, and it's being so affected. If before we already had, I just got this number, like 264 million suffering depression in the world, and this is rising. And distress is rising. Like even in May, it was like 35%. There's a study saying like 35% of people in China are distressed, 60% were in Iran, and there was 45% of distress in the US. And this has been rising from what I see in the data. So, and there's only like one healthcare worker, mental health care worker for every 10,000 people on average in the world. So if we're not helping or putting into this education, into our education, a way to deal with ourselves and have this social and emotional competency, as Mark is saying, if we can't know how we feel, and we don't know how to deal with what we feel, and we don't know how to relate with others. I'm just seeing this because, for example, in our country, we have this, and yeah, one of the priorities is social emotional learning, but there are no means of how to help teachers train in it, clear ways to do it, and how to sustain that. And I think that really, I was looking back and thinking, we haven't really gone so far in those like Delors and UNESCO 4 pillars of education in terms of learning how to be and learning how to live together, right? And it's there since 1996, but we really do not know how to be with ourselves and how to be with others, and the increase in loneliness and the increase in interfamily violence, for example, in Mexico, it's brutal. And so there we are, and as you were all saying, we're trying to keep up with the learning, but we're having all these interpersonal and emotional and social problems now. So I think that it is really important that we do focus in addressing this first, and even speaking with some of the like ministers and states, ministers of some states of ministers of education, some states in Mexico, they were saying before a child can learn, we have to address how the child feels and what's going on with them. It's been really strenuous for the kids, and I mean, we were all addressing these things that are so true in Mexico with such a lack of accessibility, and there are so many things happening that even before we try to catch up, as Mark was saying, we need to address what is currently happening. And I think this really addresses or points out to what Stavros wrote in his piece in the book that I really, really enjoyed, of focusing in the center of the individual. How do we work with our own minds and the hearts, and and this, as Mark was saying, is a long life development. So we really have to persevere in the mastery of ourselves, in being able to live within our emotions, live with others, and know how to be resilient in a context, because I think COVID is one crisis, but it will bring other crises after this, and we will have, as you were saying, it will take many months, as the example that Ceci was saying, if it took 14 months to recover, 4 months but imagine how long this will take us as a society where not everybody is sick in terms of COVID, but I think most of us, or maybe all of us, or most of us, are really affected emotionally, economically, socially. So this will take a whole world a good amount to recover. So I think that these skills that are you were also addressing what would serve for everyone, right? So these skills that could really build on us being able to have that attentiveness and being able to calm ourselves and be present to where we are, to build this kindness and connectedness that we need to have, the clarity and insight, like have this basic mental hygiene of knowing how to deal with our thoughts and our emotions, and this sense of purpose and direction, and that really is back to basic human values. I think that one thing that I think Andreas was addressing that in his piece, right? Like maybe we cannot do many things, but we can connect with our values at this point, you know, and we can from that help kids address find purpose and meaning in whatever is happening now. So I think one thing that we've been trying here and changing or putting into our courses, going virtual, but also really trying to help, or for me, the focus would be really the adults. And I heard Daniela and I heard everybody talk about teachers and how teachers are, we need to help them too. So if we can help the adults, you know, really, first of all, address the issue of how they are feeling. And Castle was giving all these good advice of the Collaborative for Academic and Social Emotional Learning was giving all this advice of we need to have the adults have time to discuss on how they're feeling and what's happening to them, to be able to connect. And I'm talking about the teachers, the principals, the leaders, but I'm also now, I think, talking about the parents that are so involved now more than involved or not involved or absent, but having a much more stronger role. We're asking parents to take over many of the things that are not of education. So how can we help them? Or this was the suggestion from Casa. I think it's wonderful to have spaces to talk with peers, to really address what's going on emotionally, and of course give them some tools to work with the current situation for them. I think if we cannot accept or address the fact that it's, as Mark was saying, and I think you're all addressing, if things are so complex, how can I even know if I'm overwhelmed? How can I even be there for these kids that need me so badly, right? And so I think if we can really help the adults address what's going on and then give them some specific tools to work with themselves, then they can be the adult in the room. And like Mark's saying, we're all like out of it sometimes, but at least you know that that's okay, and that kids can feel that it's okay, and that we can be those adults in the room, not just in terms of knowledge, but of emotion and connection. So I think that that would be the way that we're trying to go there. And then with the reality of having a 45% cut on teacher training for 2021, right? So I don't really know. So I would love to see much more consistency between what we want and what we're actually doing or putting our effort into, right? But definitely I think that having or addressing this and trying to give the adults the capacities to address the kids, and then as other people were mentioning, then you need the curriculum that's particular for each age appropriate curriculum, and you need to build this positive climate even within this virtual reality that helps the children be and really build a common shared vision. I think that would be the leadership role, to enhance this spaces, this common spaces between adults, and then to build a common vision. What do we really want to educate now? Because crises like this will happen again and again. You know, I hope not like this one, but if it's not this one, it will be another. So how do we become resilient and more able to deal with the crises, to deal with them together, and to have that sanity, basic sanity and well-being?
Thank you so much, Daniela. You can see a lot of what you were saying was really resonating with people in the audience as well, and particularly that idea of mental hygiene. I'd love to bring Andreas in at this point, please. I mean, you have a reasonably unique vantage point over a lot of the innovations and reforms that have been taking place over the last 6 months. And so before we open it up to a conversation across the panel, I'd love to hear from you some of the things that you've seen in the responses to COVID that you would really like education systems to hold on to when we move into a post-COVID period, and some early thoughts about how do we get those reforms and innovations to stick?
Yeah, I think the crisis has most obviously accelerated lots of technological innovation in education, but it has also inspired a lot of important social innovation that I think will be worth keeping when things get back to normal. First of all, I think we all experienced during the lockdown that learning is not a place, but an activity. In fact, students who knew how to learn, who were owners of their own learning, who had access to some technology, but most importantly, students who were embedded in a supportive ecosystem that is conducive to learning, they actually quickly found their way around closed school doors. And I think, as Asif was saying, this is always a whole of society project. And let's hope that, lots of those students are going to go back to their teachers and will tell them, hey, there's so many interesting ways to learn, so many amazing resources in our communities. Why can't we do more of that in school? And I hope that, we're going to see lots of teachers who will say, well, I'm no longer just an instructor. I have learned how to design innovative learning environments. I've learned how to become a good mentor, a good coach, a great facilitator, a good evaluator of student learning. And I think, I like my job so much more. And what makes this crisis different is the scale. And that means the teachers and students know they're no longer alone in this with a crisis. Everybody has experiences. And that's what makes me hopeful that this innovation could be scaling. The second part that I think has become quite clear is that learning is not mainly a transactional phenomenon, but a social and a relational phenomenon. Now, that's why MOOCs and technology without people have failed so bitterly. The one thing that students are going to remember 10 years from now is the one teacher who was with them when they struggled at home alone, who knew their dreams and passions, who were able to unlock their energy to continue studying. And technology can amplify and accelerate good teaching, but it doesn't replace that kind of social and relational aspect. So I think that's something very, very central to the future of education. And it's interesting, when we surveyed countries in May at the OECD, just 22% of them were actually aiming at the status quo. You can see over half of the countries looking to hybrid models of learning where the virtual and the personal world are integrated. So I think actually this has got really to the roots of educational design. Now, it's easy to say, really hard to do. And you can see that over half of the school leaders in the OECD countries see their teachers as having the necessary technological and pedagogical skills to do that in a meaningful way. And these are countries that have the means. But still, I think the people are not prepared. So getting teachers actively engaged as creative designers is going to be key to sustaining both pedagogical, social, and also technical innovation. I think Daniela mentioned this, and where educators are not going to be part of the design of the solutions, they're not going to help us with implementing them. I think this is why I don't like so much this term, let's train the teachers more. I think that is doing with teachers what we do with students. I think the answer is that school needs to become more of a place where everybody learns. Students learn, teachers learn, parents learn. And again, I think the crisis has facilitated this. I think we have seen those examples. Parents have become part of the equation. I think that is hopefully going to stay with us. And but I also think sort of the most important transformation that I've really seen is that people are starting to ask the question, not just of the how, the means, the technology of education, but they are now looking at the question of the what. What is it that young people need to be learning to be prepared for future? And I think everybody understands that this is not just about teaching people something, but about giving people a reliable compass and the tools to navigate for themselves in this world that is going to remain complex, volatile, and the future is going to continue to surprise us. It may not be a crisis, but it means that the world will be very, very different. And you see so many people redefining education around identity, around student agency, around purpose, and around building curiosity, opening minds, about compassion. opening hearts and about, courage, how we mobilize our cognitive, social, and emotional resources. I very much like what Mark had to say on this. I think that's actually becoming mainstream thinking now. It used to be sort of discussed in some academic circles. I do think you have a lot of people, in educators, but also policymakers now thinking about how do we redefine the what? How do we engage those ideas in curriculum design, curriculum implementation? They're very, very promising and interesting solutions coming up in all corners of the world. I think that's also interesting that you can see, whether you talk to people in Japan or China or in the United States or in Europe, they actually come to very, very similar kind of answers and solutions. It's about empathy at the individual level, but it's also how we build more bridging social capital. Basically, how do we actually understand to work with people who think differently from us, who are differently from us? And by the way, it's going to be our next PISA assessment in just a month. It's actually going to look at those kinds of aspects. They are so crucially important. And I am pretty confident that there is enough momentum actually for a good discussion, not just about individual change, but about systemic change. So I'm quite hopeful that we have enough momentum for that at this moment.
Thank you. I think that optimism is something that's been really encouraging to take from what all of you have said so far in the conversation. One of the things which is coming up a lot in the chat on Zoom, and I think builds on some of what Andreas was just saying, is this idea of the importance of agency, both student and teacher agency in education, which hasn't been something which has had that much prominence in the recent past. And I would love to open the conversation to all of you to get your thoughts on how we can create greater, stronger cultures of agency in individual institutions, and where you've seen interesting examples of that make a difference. So that is an open question to anyone. Mark, you've unmuted first. Thank you.
Sure, I'll jump in. I couldn't agree more. I think agency is important. I just want to overemphasize that I think that word also brings up individualism and too much for me, in terms of, we are embedded in systems. And so it's like concepts like grit, that I think often get a bad rap. I think grit is important. I'm glad that I have grit. But it's insufficient if the conditions, that you are in are not supporting your healthy development. So agency is important, couldn't agree more, but I just want to make sure that we stay attuned to the fact that agency without support is no agency at all.
Yeah, I also think, we in our work on the future of education, we always use the terms agency and co-agency. It's about, being able to mobilize your own cognitive, social, emotional resources, but also to see the other, the other at the individual level, the other at the aggregate level. Unfortunately, the last 10, 15 years, we have seen education gone the other way around. Actually, this trend towards commodification has become very important. Students becoming just consumers of learning experiences, teachers becoming service providers, parents becoming clients, and that has actually created a distance that I think has not been helpful. But again, I think this crisis has shown that model doesn't serve us, and so I think this idea of agency and co-agency is becoming quite central to questions around.
Relatedly, Andreas, it's like the same thing of like self-control, right? Or self-regulation. Like if you're yelling at a child to calm down, it's not very helpful. So, the system has to be well regulated, so that the individual can develop. It's like empathy, right? We empathize. I mean, it's almost as if we socialize empathy out of our children, right? We know from research with infants, they're naturally empathic, but somehow or another we pull the empathy out instead of creating the conditions for empathy to flourish.
I was thinking about the agency and co-agency, and I really think that the thought of having agency in your well-being and common well-being, because your well-being cannot, as you're both mentioning, be separated from others. No, we're not islands, and we live within each other's. But I think that if we can know that we do have agency upon ourselves and upon our well-being, that well-being is a skill, and if we can find those basic skills that help us build that, and knowing that we really have to, there is no way that our well-being can be isolated from others or in detriment of others' well-being, right? I mean, maybe in a moment, maybe for a little while, no, for a pleasurable moment, but like in the long run, like we really need to think of as us embedded in a system. And I think that's one amazing thing of the pandemic that is so evident, that we're so interdependent, that there is such a close tie, and that we are so together and so basically similar, in our humanity. But I think in terms of agency, for me, agency in knowing that you can do something, even though the world is such a complex place and there's such difficulty and there's such lack of everything in many cases, or such difficulties, you always have the agency to work with what's important for you. You always have the agency to be able to work with yourself and those close to you. And I think and work for that well-being that is beyond, like being a consumer of other things, as Andreas is saying, but something that you can really build from within. And I think that if we can have that idea, as you said, in this innovation, that on the what of education, right? Educating ourselves to be agents of our own inner emotional well-being, and knowing that that is not disconnected with others, that kindness and care for others is adamant and crucial for that inner well-being. I think that would be amazing to understand that we have agency, because it can be really depressing to feel you cannot do anything, but you can always do something, if you take that capacity on with yourself and those around you in your circumstance. So I think that would be something I'd love to think of agency as agency for well-being.
Thank you.
Yes,
Oh,
Juliet.
Daniela, please go.
Yes, I think there are two sides of the same coin, actually. I remember in 1990, when the World Conference on Education was organized, there was one of the goals which had to do with life skills, developing life skills. And I quite appreciate what Mark said about emotional learning. Okay, you need to be aware of yourself, take control of yourself, know what you're about, your purpose, your goal, and all of that. But at the same time, remembering that you're connected with somebody else. I mean, this pandemic, for instance, has shown us that for instance, my maid, my housemaid, her health is my health. My health is her health. So while I'm taking care of myself, I'm also taking care of her. So there's an interconnectedness that we cannot really ignore. When you talk about compassion, I like the word that you used. Who was it? You said compassion, courage, all this about emotional learning. It's a matter of not only attending to yourself, but also taking others along with you, looking at not only your own well-being, but the well-being of others, and how we all interconnect. In the education system right here in Sierra Leone, we're really thinking of how we can transform the whole system so that we do not just focus on students and teachers in the traditional sense of the word, but looking at all the kinds of people, all the kinds of personnel that can come in and give of their best to the system. Now we're looking at itinerant teachers, we're looking at coaches, even parents. All of these come together, bring us into a unique kind of collaboration where we think not only of ourselves, but how we work with others and how we support others. This is extremely important for us right now.
Can I? Yeah. I would echo. I mean, what Daniela and Mark said has kind of resonated me so well, because what we are seeing, we cannot see these issues in isolation, right? Essentially, the interconnectedness is something that we are seeing. On one hand, we are seeing poverty level. If I look at Bangladesh, just within 6 months has gone up from 18% to 39%. So in sheer number, you have additional 20 million of new poor people. Now, when I go to their and talk to them and their children's well-being and stuff, I mean, they're, of course, the first thing they want to talk about is their livelihood, right? So, but then there also this other conversation that is happening. We have support line, mental health support line, where people just call in, and it's not, you know, middle class people, you know, people from low income, others. They're calling in. They just wanna. They're just basically calling in to say, I just want to talk to somebody because I feel so worried. I mean, essentially what Daniela was saying, that talking to parents has become so important, just to, because they have so many different kinds of anxiety. They automatically basically move this education at the very lower tier. And that all these things we talk about is this girls getting married off early, their children are dropping out. These are all kind of linked to these anxieties and the anxieties about their own livelihood. So essentially, I think the one silver lining that I see out of this whole issue is that everybody is realizing again and again how important social and emotional learning is, how important the mental health for everyone. It cannot be thought of as somebody, this is for the rich and the middle class. Everybody, I mean, how do we embed that in our primary system? How do we embed that within, so that we can scale that up across the board? Basic care and basic learning around how to sort of keeping your, for the lack of better words, sanity in a sense, because you need to take care of your own health, mental health. And that needs to be mainstreamed across the board. I mean, and I'm just saying that because that impacts everything, you know, whether it's education, whether it's livelihood, whether your you know, violence against women that we are seeing, which has gone up. So it's all these issues are very, very interconnected. Thank you.
Hey, Julia, can I just add one thing?
Yes, please go.
I think one of the largest challenges that we have in this space of social and emotional learning is that we as educators are typically the knowers, right? We have the knowledge that we impart upon people, right? I teach you this, and then you take a test and you get the answer correct or not, and then you pass and you go on. And I think social and emotional development needs to be looked at completely differently, because there is no criterion of correctness. And I think that's very challenging, you know, because my strategy for dealing with my feelings as a Jewish gay male, right, might be very different, you know, than a Black woman or a Latino, you know, male. And it's not for me to tell someone else, you know, here is the correct way to deal with your feelings, right? It's for our educators and our families to help children explore, right, for them, what works best for them, and to practice that and to refine that and become scientists themselves about their own emotional life. And so I think that's hard for people. I think that's kind of a part of this reimagining education, which is not having the sage on the stage, but rather having the teacher as coach, as facilitator, the parent as coach and facilitator, help children discover for them what works best. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Mark. And this is a fascinating discussion, and I wish we had another hour to unpack some of these themes. But since we have to wrap up here in the next few minutes to prepare for our closing and the official launch of our ebook, we just want to end with a final question relating back to SDG 4, as it's only fitting since this is UN Global Goals Week. As many of you know, Jacob Trollback, who is the designer who came up with the SDG icons, has said that we should think of the goals as themes or campaign areas, and that it is the indicators that underpin them which set forth the reform agenda. Now, we'll let you all answer this question, and we'll go in order of by way of which we started, but which SDG 4 indicator do you see as being the most integral to realizing your vision for a reimagined education? So Asif, we'll start with you, and then after that, we'll go to Daniela.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think it's definitely 4.5, which is around ensuring gender disparities across the world, so ensuring equal access. I think that's very, very crucial. If we want to create a world without discrimination, we cannot do that without ensuring gender equality. I think that's very, very important. Thank you.
Thank you, Asif. I agree with you. Daniela, would you like to go next?
My mic on. Yes, inclusive, ensuring that all children have access, equitable access to quality education. For us in Sierra Leone, that's a big thing. It's our goal. Now we're talking about radical inclusion. We're even including pregnant girls, getting them to go back to school to continue their education. And they're doing extremely well. So yes, inclusive education, getting all children involved and accessing quality education. And of course, being the chair of the Teaching Service Commission, I have to look at SDG 4C, which is about teachers. And here, looking at what Mark has said, we cannot put them in a compartment by themselves as teachers. We have to think broader. We have to think of teachers even as being parents. So we're looking at all of this now, because I was going to say I limit it to teachers as we know them to be. But since this conversation has started, I'm now thinking more broadly of who are these teachers, their coaches, the facilitators, their parents, even the children knows a thing or two which they can teach their teachers. So we have to think more broadly. And yes, I hope we succeed in doing what we have started to do in Sierra Leone.
Thank you so much, Daniela. Now we'll go to Becky.
Thanks. So actually I'm going for one which is outside of the education SDG, and it's 1.31, which is the proportion of populations covered by social protection. And I think this is just recognizing, as we said, education doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's like parents sending their children to school, it's teachers going in to teach. It's people feeling confident that they can keep children staying in school, that, we have a lot of evidence about dropout rates and why children are dropping out. And it's very often financial and it's opportunity cost. So I think looking at how people's, how family costs are covered and how social protection works to ensure this kind of sense of safety and a sense of continuity is something that will really help with access.
Thank you so much, Becky. Now I'd like to turn to Mark.
Something, I'm taking copious notes. Can you ask the question again, please?
Sorry, speaking with my unmute. Which SDG 4 indicator do you see as being the most integral to realizing your vision of what a reimagined education would look like?
I have to say, I have to just go with what's like all I can think about right now, which may or may not be the answer to your question, which is that I just think if you take a step back at our world right now, we need more ethical, socially and emotionally intelligent role models. And so that's just the way I feel in terms of what we need role models who are letting people know that the things that we all care about are important.
That's an excellent response. Thank you so much, Mark. Daniela?
Well, I was reading through them and they're all important, but I thought at 4.7, when it says education for a sustainable development and global citizenship, because somehow, and even though it doesn't address well-being as a word, but it does address all the skills and values and attitudes to have productive lives, informed decisions, active role. So for me, that goal, which are the skills? What are we going to teach, right? What are we going to educate? And those skills that allow us to be happy, healthy, ethical human beings, I think, that take care of each other.
Thank you so much, Daniela. And then, of course, Andreas.
Yeah, it's a difficult question, and I would put goal 4.5 on equity and inclusion first, but not inclusion in the sense of getting everybody involved in current education, but in reimagining education to really respond to the individual needs of people and to understand how different people learn and live differently.
Well, thank you very much to all of you, to Asif, Daniela, Becky, Mark, Daniela, and Andreas. This is the final event in this year's Disrupted Education Reimagined series. So I'd like to take the opportunity to again thank friends and colleagues at WISE and Salzburg Global for all of their help with the 3 conferences in the series and the ebook. And I'd now like to hand over to Dr. Asma Al-Fadala for some closing remarks, which is entirely appropriate because the ebook was Dr. Asma's idea after the very first conference. And she wrote to Julia and me saying that she was so inspired by all of the different contributions that we'd heard from the speakers. It would be wonderful to capture them and turn them into an ebook. And so many of the speakers responded incredibly positively to that idea. The book has been downloaded almost 3,000 times in the week since we published it last week. It is available for free on WISE's website, on Salzburg Global's website, or on our partner and publisher Diplomatic Courier's website, because I know a number of people have been asking for the link in the chat. Thank you very much again to the panelists and to all of you for joining us today. And Dr. Asma, over to you to close us out.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us from around the world. Assalamu alaikum from Doha. My name is Asma Al-Fadala, and I'm the Director of Research at WISE and the lead editor of this ebook. Leading this project during the COVID pandemic has been an overwhelming but positive experience. Of course, I didn't do it alone, and I have plenty of people I need to thank. So first of all, thank you to all my co-editors, my amazing team and colleagues at WISE, our partners, Salzburg Global Seminar and the Diplomatic Courier. And of course, to all the brilliant contributors who responded to our call for contribution for this publication. As Anna Rold from our media partner Diplomatic Courier said, I've run many editorial projects, but none where we had such an immediate positive response from everyone that was asked to participate. Personally, I feel an overwhelming sense of gratitude to work with and be part of this global community. And this book has demonstrated that when we come together, we can respond to the current crisis from a space of deeper understanding, collaboration, and support. I will not explain the content of the book, and I think the panel discussion covered it very well, and I encourage you to read the book and share your thoughts and feedback. Instead, I want to focus my remarks on the book's journey. Why did we feel that it was important to write this book? And most importantly, what did we learn from the experience? To answer the first question, we felt that it was our duty at WISE to not only provide a convening space and forum to bring people together and exchange ideas, but to also record the incredible content, inspiration, and ideas that were coming out of our Education Disrupted, Education Reimagined event series, which began at the beginning of this crisis in April. As you know, this book was derived from the series, which brought together more than 5,000 participants from 98 countries and over 100 speakers over the course of 3 events in April, June, and September. In fact, it was one of our UN contributors from UNRWA, from our first event in April, who noted that for all other sectors, there are detailed historical records of a crisis response. But for education, we seem to be lacking this. So we wanted to change this. So we hope that this book offers an opportunity to a global audience to make sense of what happened in education during the crisis, while also offering a breeding ground of ideas from some of the world's top education thinkers. We hope that through this publication, we provide the education community with a reference point for the crisis from which future research, policy, and innovation can grow. We also wanted to use the space of disruption to innovate as an organization on how we deliver and share information to our community. While the lockdown is transforming how we learn and steering the process towards digital, as our ebook shows, the impact will last beyond the COVID quarantine period. One major change is the availability of educational content digitally, and most of it is now for free, especially after several public universities granted access to their online libraries. As per a survey by tech company Fairgaze, they found over 45% people believe that online content will replace books. This has prompted publication houses across the globe to adopt innovative methods to stay relevant during and post-COVID era. And the same holds true for us at WISE. Even before the crisis, we were looking for new ways to replace our printed books and reports with digital interactive material that could easily be accessed by all members of our global community. This book is another step towards that goal, and its format is meant to be easily accessible, readable, and compelling. As for the second point here, what we learned in this process, and beyond the many takeaways from the extraordinary content of the book, which you just got a glimpse of it in the panel discussion today, I want to highlight three main learning lessons. Number one, every part of the process is a progress, even when you are stuck and blocked. And I'm referring here you as a writer, a researcher, an editor. The pandemic has offered all of us its fair share of obstacles and roadblocks. But in the wake of a crisis and a tragedy also comes opportunity for innovation, change, empathy, and great collaboration. And I'm so proud of producing this work. Number two, the need to understand your long-term priorities. Many of us through this period have been juggling tasks between work, family, and if you are like me, the added burden of 5 kids at home doing remote schooling. Some of us have also been dealing with tragedy and economic hardship. So keeping sight of your long-term priorities is a helpful way to keep yourself focused on your goals when everything around you seems to be in chaos. And finally, the third point, the importance of setting deadlines, either at work or in life. Douglas Adams wrote, "I love deadlines. I like the whooshing sound they make as they fly by." But we, in putting together this book, we didn't have that luxury. With many other commitments and 50 plus contributors, hard deadlines prevented any delay. And I know for myself going forward, this will be my new mantra in work and in life. So I hope these lessons will be relevant to you all. To conclude, I want to end with a quote from our book about leading during crisis, which I think is relevant to all sectors and situations, whether it's in education, in government, or even in one's personal life. It is from Alan Walker, Dean of Faculty of Education at the University of Hong Kong. On page 104 of the ebook, he described how we lead during crisis. I'm quoting him, "Managing normality while managing disruption, looking for speed while looking for sense, promoting innovation while seeking consistency, pushing innovation while searching for coherence, caring for staff while caring about learning, spreading decisions while making decisions, learning while unlearning, making decisions for us while watching for others, caring for people while maintaining standards, and finally, and most importantly, caring for self while caring for others. I hope you all enjoy the book, and thank you so much for joining our discussion today, and congratulations for all of us.